everyone. This is Real Talk on Racism, and I'm your host, Lisa Hurley. Today, I'm super excited to welcome our guest, Madison Butler. Welcome, Madison. Madison, aka the blue-haired unicorn, is an activist, a writer. She's the founder of the Black Speakers Collection. She's also a speaker, DEI consultant, you name it. You name it, you do it, right, Madison? And one of her favorite phrases is, "That's the tea." So with that being said, welcome, Madison, and let's get ready to spill some tea.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you too. Thank you too. So let's get right into it. Among all those other titles that I just listed, you're an activist. So what got you started on your journey of activism?
Honestly, I think for me, I fell into it. I was a complete different version of myself for a lot of my life. And I spent a lot of my early 20s learning that I had to unpack basically everything I've ever learned up until this point. I spent a large portion of my life feeling like I had to lean into whiteness and lean into what society expected of me. And because of that, I was like a very Banana Republic-esque version of myself.
I so understand that. I think I also have had that version of myself as well. And it comes from like trying to fit in, right?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
And it's also the fact that when you look at what success is, if you look at the media, it's very much modeled by whiteness and people who then adhere to those standards. So if you can't be white, you try to get as close to it as you possibly can. And you want to get so close you can touch it. So you straighten your hair and you change your outfits and you make sure you turn your phone voice on from 9 to 5 every day so you sound approachable.
Absolutely.
And for me, that led me to being with someone who was really bad for me. And because I craved the acceptance of whiteness so badly, I ignored how badly he treated me. And our relationship was incredibly violent. It was incredibly abusive. And he was just like a racist, like a flat out racist. And when we got out of that relationship, lucky me, our relationship made BuzzFeed. And all of a sudden, little like mid-20s me, who didn't know how to use the internet, mind you, my breakup was everywhere. And everything that everyone said about me was this black girl this and that black girl this. And it was the first time that I had a very public reckoning with no matter how hard I tried to touch whiteness, I wasn't going to be. It wasn't going to happen. I was always going to be a black woman. And so it took a lot of time to unlearn everything I'd ever thought of, everything I'd ever thought of myself in my personal life. And it took a little bit longer to realize I was still doing that at work. And a lot of my activism is centered around corporate spaces because I very much recognize the patterns of abuse that I saw in my relationship played out in corporate America.
Ooh, yes. I can relate. I can relate actually on both fronts. And speaking about how important blackness and representing blackness became to you, you recently founded the Black Speakers Collection. And I have a couple of questions. Of course, I want to ask how it came about, but also you deliberately, I'm assuming, called it the Black Speakers Collection, not the BIPOC Speakers Collection. So I'll leave those with you and tell me what you can about it.
Yeah, so like a lot of things in my life, I have ADHD and I'm really good at hyperfocusing. So if I have an idea, I tend to like obsess about it a little bit. But what originally happened was I was starting to think about Black History Month last December and how often people wait till like, I don't know, January 29th to be like, oh my God, we need a speaker. Are you available? And it's like, no, I'm not. I'm actually fully booked until next year. Would you like to book me for next year? And then I really started even zooming out further and how many people only get booked for Black History Month or how many LGBTQ speakers only get booked for Pride, as if the only thing I can come and talk about is trauma. The only thing I can come and talk about is DEI. When in actuality, there are Black speakers in every genre, every vertical, every topic you could dream of. And often we are kind of cast aside unless it's to come talk about the trauma that we live through every day. And I wanted to have a space where people could just, one, exist from an internal perspective and talk about all of the stuff that we go through as people in the Black speaking space, but also I wanted to just every time you ask someone, like, why don't you have any Black speakers? Their answer is, I couldn't find any.
There's a pipeline problem.
There's a pipeline problem. And I wanted to disprove that theory. I wanted to make it so easy so that when Black speakers weren't on your panel, weren't in your conference, it is intentional. You have done that intentionally. And that's okay. Go ahead and say that. But don't say it's because we don't exist. Because we certainly do.
We're there. So how many speakers are in the collection right now? Because I know it grew rapidly, right?
Yes, about 3,000 in over, I think, 100 verticals. So when people tell me they can't find a Black speaker, I'm like, are you sure? Have you actually looked outside of your own network? Because here's the thing. So many of us network for sameness that if you stick a little fishnet in, guess what you're going to pull up? People who are similar to yourself. You have to do the work to find speakers who are different than the people that you see day in and day out. And most people don't want to do that. And it's not just speaking. We see it played out in recruiting, in hiring, in promotion processes. And that's something that we're all very familiar with.
Oh my gosh, much too familiar.
Unfortunately.
Much too familiar. Something that you posted recently on LinkedIn, and yes, Madison and I follow each other on LinkedIn, yay. But something you posted recently was something akin to Black is not a bad word.
Yes.
Can you tell me what led you to write that, to post that?
So there's two things, which oftentimes I specifically use my platform to amplify Black voices and also talk about the things that not everyone has the ability to say safely. I understand there's a ton of privilege in me being able to get on LinkedIn and say exactly what I want and what I'm feeling because I have an employer who supports me. I am not at risk of losing my job. And so I feel like it's my role to use that position to uplift people who aren't in the position to be able to speak about things. And a lot of those times, those topics are focused on Blackness. And you'll have people roll in and they're like, well, this could apply to blank, or this could apply to blank. And I'm like, that's awesome, that's great. This is not who this is for or about. This is about Black women. This is about Black people. And then you have the other people who are like, well, you don't have to say Black. You could just say the post without saying Black. If I said Black, I meant Black, because at the end of the day, I am a Black woman, and nothing changes if I choose to not say Black. And whether or not Black makes you uncomfortable because all of a sudden we're bringing race into it, that's very much a you problem. If you cannot talk about racial politics in this country without wanting to jump out of your seat and run away from me, that's something we've got to unpack. Because at the end of the day, I don't get to take that off. I don't get to pretend I'm not Black. I don't get to enter into a room and be like, don't look at me, I'm not Black. Because if I get pulled over, guess what the first thing they know about me is? That I'm Black. Yep. They're not asking me where I went to college, what my job is, where I live. The first thing they see when I roll down my window is that I am a Black woman.
And so, well, there's a lot to unpack there. But I've also noticed on LinkedIn that you deal with a lot of harassment. First of all, do you pronounce it harassment or harassment? I never know which one.
I think it's harassment.
Is it harassment?
I mean, I guess it depends.
The
English language is kind of...
Right? It's like, and I feel like as a language person I should know this. It probably depends whether it's like US English or British English or something. Anyway, but we digress. So yeah, tell me about the harassment that you go through and how do you deal with that? I'm sure, of course, it is because of the way you post, you're unapologetic, you post about Blackness, etc., etc. So, yeah. So
for me, there's two parts of it. I feel like I deal with it a little bit differently simply because I lived with, to me, feels like the scariest person on earth. So it's hard for me to take online people seriously when they're like, oh, you're fat, or oh, you're ugly. And I'm like, okay, random stranger on the internet who felt like you should say that in front of your whole network and your boss.
Your employer.
Like, oof, super oof. But then on the flip side, we did have someone show up at our home in 2020. And when I think about why people react this way, I think of it as how fearful people are to lose their position in society and how that makes them feel like rats kind of trapped in a corner. Because when you realize your place in society is built on privilege and not your ability to be successful or your hard work or your intelligence, that's a really hard pill to swallow, to realize that you are where you are simply because of who you are, not because of what you've done. And a lot of people aren't ready to reckon with that yet. They're not ready to acknowledge that their place in society was always built on mediocrity and never meritocracy. And unfortunately, that scares people a lot.
Well, I guess it would make them have to change their entire worldview and self-concept.
Yes. And it's not even that. Like, you can have these really hard conversations with yourself in the mirror about, like, oh gosh, everything I've ever learned was wrong. But that's not the only conversation you're having. You're now also having, oh God, here are all the ways that my parents were wrong and my grandparents were wrong. And here's all the harm they've caused and all the harm I've caused. And that I often find is the hardest part to grapple with, because we live in this world where we've really been conditioned to believe good and bad is a binary. Either you're a good person or you're a bad person. And when you start to have these conversations, you have to acknowledge where you've caused harm. And because of how we've been conditioned to exist, you're automatically throwing yourself in the bad person bin. And most people don't want to be bad people. They want to be good partners, good co-workers, good neighbors, whatever it is. And so it's much easier for them to fall on this defensive where, no, you're wrong. I never meant it like that. Why would you take it out of context that way? I'm not like that. I have a black friend, or whatever it is. And it's easier for them to go down this route than to acknowledge all of the hard things, because they now have to believe, well, am I a bad person? And at the end of the day, you're not. It doesn't make you a bad person.
It doesn't.
No, and we'll all cause harm. There's not a day, even when you do this work, that you stop causing harm. You're always going to accidentally say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing. We're consistently in a space of growth and learning. That doesn't stop. But it doesn't make you bad. It just means you have to be willing to let your ego go. You have to let your ego sit to the side and say, okay, I'm going to do better. I want to learn more. I want to say I'm sorry occasionally. And unfortunately, a lot of people aren't ready to do that.
Are a lot of people ready to call themselves an ally?
So actually, I think more people are.
This is not an accidental question.
I think more people are ready to call themselves an ally than they are to do the work. I think a lot of people want to be like that TikTok trend, like ally, but they don't actually want to be an ally. They want the title of ally. An ally is not a self-proclaimed title. It is something you do. You can't just be like, oh, well, I read White Fragility one time.
I knew you were going to cite that one. Yes.
I gave my money to a white woman, and now I'm an ally. How can I help you? Can I put it on my resume? I joined my company's DEI committee. We threw a party. Like, that's not what being an ally is. Being an ally means doing the work, and for me, the most important part of this work is the self-work. If I can't even get you to do the self-work, how can I get you to do anything else?
I mean, points have been made. So how do you, in your work and your life, there's so many intersectionalities that you deal with, and intersectionality is a topic that you often speak about on LinkedIn and in other places. How do you, I guess, live through and deal with all your intersectionalities, and how do you model, I guess, a positive way of moving through life for others?
So I think for me, it's acknowledging that every part of my identity inherently makes me who I am as a person. My queerness is just as important as my blackness, and it took me a really long time to even say that I had ADHD out loud, because I thought that it would make me less than, and it would make me less desirable as an employee, and less desirable even to myself. And
interesting. Okay. Do explain. Less desirable to yourself.
Because I guess for so long, I just felt like I was coping with it, and this must just be how everyone feels. Everyone must get panicked when their room is messy. Like, doesn't everyone feel that way? And so when I had to admit that it was actually something with me and not something maybe everyone experienced, I think that makes me feel kind of bad. Like, is there something wrong with me? When in actuality, now when I think about it, so much of my ADHD works with me and for me, like maybe not the 1,000 tabs I have open on my laptop, but my ability to sit down and just crank out work is phenomenal. I just have to put on one Drake album and I'm good. When I wrote my writing sample for my book, I literally locked myself in a hotel room and wrote 10,000 words in a night.
In a night?
In a night. And so
that is a superpower.
And so
I think we can agree.
And so for me, that is what it feels like now, but it used to feel like a weakness. Like for me to have to tell an employer that I had ADHD or ask for an accommodation, I think for me felt like weakness. When now I know it's not a weakness, it's just a part of who I am, and barriers I face aren't because of my ADHD, it's because not every space was made for me. Not every space was made to be accessible. I think the other part about being open about intersectionality, for me that's really important, is acknowledging that there are barriers I face, and they're not because of my identities, they're because of white supremacy. But in the same breath, I also have a ton of privilege because of the intersectional identities I hold. I am a college graduate, I am a native English speaker, I am a citizen, I own a home, my parents are still together, and being able to acknowledge the privilege that I hold in the world is really important, because I think part of this is, sometimes when you say the word privilege, people again, they do that thing where they want to get up and run from you. And privilege isn't a bad word.
It isn't a bad word.
No.
None of them are bad. Black is not a bad word. Privilege is not a bad word. None of them are bad words.
And for me, I want people to normalize the concept of we all have privilege in some way. And that's why when I say you have white privilege, I'm not saying your life was easy. I'm just saying we enter rooms very differently. And being able to acknowledge that I have some privilege and that has contributed to where I am in life is very important, because part of being an ally is using your privilege to empower and lift up others. If I can always reach behind me to uplift others, then my privilege matters, because I'm using it for good. Now, if you're using privilege to climb the corporate ladder and step on people while you go, then yes, privilege has become bad, not a bad word, but you are using it in a negative way. And I think that, again, goes back to people having to look behind them or look in the mirror and say, oh God, I've used my privilege in a way to cause harm, and now I'm a bad person. So now we're back in that same seat of trying to examine the good and bad binary.
Okay, wow. Speaking of, you mentioned self-work earlier. I'm an activist, as you are, and I totally agree that self-work is necessary. What does self-work look like for you? And you don't need, obviously, to share anything that you're not comfortable with, but what are some of the ways that you do self-work?
So I think for me, it very much looks like accountability. Accountability for the things you say, accountability for the things you do, because one of the things that I don't think people necessarily realize is that your biases don't go away. They don't necessarily disappear because you attended a workshop. They're still there. And being able to look yourself in the mirror and say, why did I have that thought? Or why did I say that thing? Or why did I treat this person this way? That was wrong, is so incredibly important, despite how hard it is to say those things to yourself or even recognize your responses to things. So for me, especially having been in such an abusive relationship, I have tons of responses that are rooted in trauma. And even being able to hold myself accountable to that, because I cannot allow my trauma to further traumatize others. And that for me is the self-work, is being very self-aware of how I interact in the world and how I treat people and how I think. And that, I think, again, is the other hard part of this, because there's no light at the end of the tunnel, and humans in general like ends. We like projects. Wow. We like a date. Yeah. And there isn't one, because at the point that you commit to do this work, you commit to doing it every day forever. Ad
infinitum.
Yeah, until whatever. And there's no ascension. There's no, you're now the Mother Teresa of DEI and self-awareness. I actually would argue it gets harder. No, we are not. And I would actually argue the deeper you get into this work, the harder the self-work is, because the more aware you are of just the things you interact with. You become very aware of the people around you, and you start to learn that people never liked you. They liked a version of you that they created in their head. They made you the exception, not the rule. Mm-hmm. And you spend a lot of time examining the life you've led, the life you're leading. And for me, that is the self-work, examining not only how you think, your relationships, but also your history and your own trauma, and being able to unpack that out loud. It's not super fun.
It isn't. It's hard. It's hard work. And I think that there are a lot of people who believe activism is just being an activist is just like another title, like ally. It's like, oh, you wake up one day, you call yourself an activist, and it's glamorous, and you're on panels and you're whatever, but it does take a lot of work, and it is hard. and people don't realize, and it's not glamorous, and it is potentially unsafe, as you mentioned earlier on, right? There's a lot that goes into it, you know?
Yeah, glamour is not one of the words that comes to mind.
Right?
No.
People seem to think that, though. It's like they see you, I mean, you have a huge following on social media, right? And I think people associate that, they draw conclusions that are not necessarily like a one-to-one correlation.
Oh yeah, and then
right?
I think, but I also think that's why a lot of people jumped into the DEI space that don't necessarily belong here, because they thought it was glamorous, they thought it was a paycheck, and let me tell you,
for some of them, it has been.
And I will tell you, the one thing that is not allyship is profiting on Black trauma. Profiting on pain that is not yours to profit on is atrocious. And I think about how often white women are out there making money on an experience that they basically read online and are now reiterating, talking about a world that was not theirs and talking about trauma that they inherently played a part in. And again, that's not doing the self-work.
No, but that is hard for a lot of people to admit to. That you are profiting from it, that you are a descendant thereof. And you are a descendant thereof.
And it's okay to say, it is so okay to say, I don't know. Because there are certain things in the space that aren't mine to talk about. I can teach from an access perspective, I can teach from a psychological safety perspective, but there are identities that I don't hold, that I don't feel the right to, one, profit on or educate on, because they're not my space to teach. And I find that a lot of people jump into this space and all of a sudden they're hosting a workshop and a 101, and 101s don't solve for anything. They may cut you a check for it, but I promise you, doing an all-company 101, everyone is like, okay, well, we listened to you for 47 minutes, see you again next year, and we'll do the exact same workshop. But what are the action items coming from that? Is anyone actually taking that back to their desk and thinking about, look, how can I strategize around this? Probably not.
Yeah, it's performative.
It's super performative. And we've seen it since 2020. Everyone wanted to be performative. Everyone realized they had to be something. They had to have some kind of PR, a black square. Here, let me tote my donation dollars. Let's host a workshop with someone famous. And that will show our customers that we care about Black people. But then you hear internally that all of their Black employees are suffering, are traumatized, are stuck in a cycle of abuse. So you don't get to say you care about Black people, but only when it benefits you.
Yeah, well, that's a whole nother topic. Whole nother topic. We might have to have you come back, because that is a show in itself. So at the top of the show, I mentioned that you are, among other things, you're a writer. If I have it correctly, you've written for Rolling Stone.
Correct.
Right? And you were recently featured by them as well on the topic of code switching.
Yes.
Can you tell me more about that? And for the benefit of our viewers today, can you explain what code switching is?
For sure. So for me, code switching is an act of self-preservation in the workplace, in life, that involves changing who you are in order to be better accepted, safer, whatever it is. And so that could be verbal, that could be emotional, that could be physical. So for me, it looked a lot like straightening my hair till my ends were ready to fall off. Again, turning on my phone voice so I sounded approachable.
I love that you act that out. It's very effective.
Laughing at jokes that weren't funny. And essentially not speaking up in moments where I knew I wanted to, because I didn't want to be the angry Black woman. And you find yourself shrinking and folding yourself into a pretzel in order to fit a mold that was never made for you. Because we all want to be able to put food on our table. We all want to be able to go to work. And at the end of the day, I am a really firm believer that exclusion is an extreme act of trauma. And we want to be accepted. And so you go to work or you go to wherever and you pretend to be someone else, and you end up being equivalently two people every day. And your body, one, can't sustain that, because you start to believe the lies you're telling yourself about, I am not good at 100. 100% me is not worthy of a paycheck, of acceptance, of friendship, of love. And then there's the fact that, how can I be good at my job if also from 9 to 5 I'm trying to win an Emmy? If I'm like going for world's best actor, how can I also be focusing on what I'm here to do, which is at the core part of it is my job. And people cannot thrive and do good work and be the employee you want them to be and be the coworker you want them to be when they're constantly suspended in this fight or flight mode. And whether or not you recognize that's where your body is, that is where your body is. And you're constantly ready to fight or flight. You can't also be like, yes, sending this Slack, yes, sending this email, and be completely engaged. It's not possible.
And so how can companies and environments make it, I guess, safer for people so that they don't feel obligated to code switch? Are there, we have a few minutes left, but do you have a couple of tips maybe?
So for me, I think it's knowing that this work and creating psychological safety is not an HR problem. It is not a recruiting problem. It is an every vertical, every person, everyday practice. Psychological safety has to be baked into your business, which comes back to we're doing self-work again, which means you have to have leaders in C-suite who are willing to unpack how the thoughts they've thought up until this point have contributed to the culture they've allowed. They have to recognize that culture is the worst thing you allow. It is not happy hours. It is not your hummus in the refrigerator. It is the worst thing that gets swept under the rug in your organization. And you need to have middle managers who want to be self-aware, who want to be vulnerable. Because when you have managers who only manage one way and they're like, well, I work great with Steven over there and everyone's going to get managed like I manage Steven. Well, guess what? Now we've all got to act like Steven. And we're not all Steven. And so in order to do that, you have to have managers who are incredibly aware of their communication styles, incredibly aware of other people's communication styles, and can be open and vulnerable about what they need from their people so that their people can be vulnerable with them.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Madison. We have come to the end, and it flew so quickly.
I know.
Right? It flew so quickly. We talked about so much. Thank you for sharing all of your expertise and your wisdom. It was so great having you here with us as a guest. So thank you. And thank you for watching. This has been Real Talk on Racism. I'm your host, Lisa Hurley, and we'll see you next time.